Tu Diep wishes you all a healthy new day. Dear friends, today we will come to Jame's story through the stories of the people where he lives and works. How will his love with Tu Diep be through the stories of the villagers? Jame was unlike any man I had ever met in the impoverished mountain villages I had visited. He didn't speak loudly, never addressed crowds, and didn't dress like the textbook image of a company director. Yet he possessed a quiet magnetism, a presence not found in appearance but in every silent action. In eyes that listened more than they spoke. In hands always covered with soil yet warm and steady. As the director of a forestry and crop cultivation company, James didn't sit behind a desk. His office was the fields, the forest paths, the tin-roofed wooden hut nestled in the hills. He would stand for hours beside stripped bare forests as if listening to whispers from the wounded earth. He didn't speak much, but each word felt like a seed, falling gently into hearts and silently sprouting. Villagers told me they didn't know what to make of him when he first arrived. A city man. Not exactly pale-skinned but clearly not born of these mountains. Suddenly appeared. Talking about intercropping, seasonal soil cycles, organic compost, and healing the red basalt earth like one would heal a broken heart. They doubted him, some even scoffed. But he never reacted. He only smiled. Then quietly began to work. He carried fertilizer bags on his back, dug planting pits himself, hauled seedlings up the steep hills. Not once or twice to make a show, but every single day, steadily, like breath. Eventually, people stopped laughing and began watching. Children called him Uncle Jame the Forest Man because after every storm, he was the first to climb up and check which trees had survived. There was something else about Jame. He loved his woman, Tu Diep, with a love that wasn't loud or flowery but saturated in small, sacred gestures. Tu Diep, his life partner, his right hand, the missing half that made Jame whole, had once been a university lecturer, brilliant and eloquent, who could have lived a soft life in the city. But she chose to be here, not from impulse, but from a deep, unwavering belief that this man and this land were where her heart belonged. In Jame's eyes when he looked at her, I saw a rare kind of peace. He didn't hold her hand in public, didn't call her sweet names, but he knew exactly when she was tired, what she needed, and what silently worried her. He walked half a step slower beside her, set a warm glass of water out every morning, sat beside her quietly on nights she couldn't sleep. The villagers loved Jame and loved Diep, not because they were rich or clever, but because they stayed. They didn't head back to the city every weekend, didn't boast of awards or projects. They simply remained, sewing each day alongside the villagers. They helped dig wells for clean water, taught women to make compost from kitchen waste, and lit lamps to teach children to read when the power failed. They never took credit. For Jame, success was seeing a family return home after years of exile, seeing a once drunk man walk his child to school, seeing green shoots burst from hardened soil. When asked why he did it, he just smiled. If no one else will, I will. Jame loved the forest with the heart of someone who had seen it die. He loved people with the faith that they weren't as broken as the world had treated them. And he loved Tu Diep with a devotion that never walked away. His love had no room for romance as the world defines it. It was in rebuilding the collapsed greenhouse in a storm because Diep had tended the seedlings all week. In remembering the dates of her menstrual cycle so the meals were gentler. In holding her silently as she cried for her late mother, not comforting, not speaking, just holding her against his chest like a quiet sky. I've met many good people working in sustainable agriculture, but Jame was the first to make me stay. He made me understand that some lives don't need to be loud or remembered in books to be deeply admirable. Because they don't work to be remembered, they work so the place they belong to becomes more peaceful, greener, and stronger. And with him was the woman who walked beside him, Tu Diep. As gentle as a spring breeze, yet as resilient as the roots of an ancient tree. I left that place with a small pouch of seeds they tucked into my palm, and with a strange certainty, life can be beautiful if we're patient enough to sow goodness. One seed at a time. As Jame did. Every single day. Without ever needing praise. Years passed. Tanfu was no longer an obscure dot on the map. The once barren hills turned lush with forests interwoven with crops. Streams that had dried up now ran clear. Thanks to James' forest, farm, family model. The people began making their own compost. Preserving their seeds. Selling their produce directly. But Jame didn't change. Still slow walking. Soft-spoken. Still muddy boots and no fancy office. Diep remained by his side. They never held a grand wedding. But the entire village saw them as husband and wife bonded like tree to earth. Diep opened a schoolroom in the community center. Sitting cross-legged with kids to teach them how to write. At night, while she stayed up worrying about coats for the children, Jame went into the woods hunting for underground springs. They never made promises to each other. But their daily presence was the strongest vow one could make. One chilly evening, as northern winds swept down the mountains, Diep stood atop a hill watching the new demo farm they had built for interns. Below in the valley lay their wooden home, weathered but unwavering. She asked, "Do you think you'll ever leave this place?" Jame took her hand. Quietly, he said, "If I ever do, it's because somewhere else needs me more. But if not, I'll stay here, plant more trees, and grow old with you." 5 years later, the company expanded into 3 neighboring provinces. But the headquarters remained, a bamboo house in the forest. Jame and Diep started welcoming orphans, turning their home into a boarding school named the Seedlings. Jame taught biology. Diep taught literature. The children called them Father Jame and Mama Diep. They never had children of their own, yet never lacked a family. One spring, an ancient sow tree at the village gate bloomed for the first time in a decade. Locals called it a good omen. They brought Jame and Diep to take a photo beneath it, a symbol of new life. Awkwardly, Jame reached out and took Diep's hand. Their eyes met. And for a moment, even time stood still. No one spoke. But everyone understood, theirs was a love rooted in soil. In storms. In years of labor so steadfast it blossomed quietly, beautiful beyond words. I visited them one last time before moving far away. Jame walked with me to the edge of the forest. Gave me a light pat on the shoulder as goodbye. But I knew, no matter where I went, their story would remain with me, like the forest. Like the earth. Like every quiet act of kindness that compels us to live better. And as I walked down the hill, past the wildflowers into the road that led away from Tanfu, I looked back once more. There, in the heart of the green canopy, their little wooden house pulsed gently like a quiet heart beating for the land. And I finally understood, some people don't need statues or news headlines. They live forever in the soil. In the stories of the people. In the harvests that no longer remember the hunger of the past. Jame never left behind an empire. He left forests, fresh springs, and fertile fields. He left behind a generation who learned to love trees, honor the land, and treat each other with kindness. And he left behind a love that didn't need declarations, but could walk an entire life without ever letting go, through drought, storms, and silence. The love between Jame and Tu Diep reminds us that loving someone is not about holding them tightly, but about walking with them toward the light, even through swamps, thorns, and unnamed roads. Their legacy is not in grandeur, but in the quiet persistence of sowing seeds, keeping promises, and believing in others one more time. If life gives us countless reasons to leave, remember this, there are people like Jame who chose to stay. And because of them, the impossible becomes home.